March 15, 1944, Ada Communications Unit outside Tokyo. Commander Atsuzo Kurihara examined his third cup of cold tea while listening to an American broadcast that none of his analysts could understand. For 3 years, the Japanese Empire had intercepted and broken British, Soviet, and American codes with almost surgical precision. This time, however, the sounds sounded like military, but they did not belong to any known language. It was the collapse of a certainty. Japan's cryptographic elite, educated at top universities and trained in German logic, now faced a phenomenon that no machine could decipher, a language with no writing, no formal grammar, no standardization, a code that breathed, that only existed within the mind of the person who spoke it. The video reveals, step by step, how one of the greatest intelligence systems of the 20th century was defeated by a group of young Native Americans armed only with their voice and an ancestral language forged in the desert. A war operation that Japan never understood. In the Pacific War, while waiting for machines, they found metaphors. While searching for patterns, they listened to poetry. And when they looked for logic, they found silence. But before we dive behind the scenes of this invisible war, there's one statistic that defines the entire scope of this story. During World War II, Japan broke more than 1,000 war codes. British ciphers, Russian cryptograms, American diplomatic cables, and secret signals from the Philippines. But a single code created by just 29 men in a makeshift barracks in the desert has never been cracked. No glitch, no loophole, no translation, not even with torture. Not even with entire universities mobilized. The Japanese heard all the messages, and they didn't understand any. If you value historical research and believe that certain achievements cannot be forgotten, consider supporting this channel. Every inscription and every share helps keep alive the memory of the codes that changed the war without making a fuss. During the early years of the war in the Pacific, few military departments boasted as much confidence as Japanese signals intelligence. The Ada Communications Unit, located about 30 kilometers from Tokyo, was the nerve center of an empire that relied on the power of interception and decoding to anticipate enemy movements. By 1942, the building operated with 118 high-frequency receivers, dozens of signal steering equipment, and more than 500 analysts working uninterrupted shifts. Many of them were graduates of Japan's top universities. Some had studied in the United States, spoke fluent English and French, and had trained under the direct guidance of German cryptanalysts. The structure was considered one of the most sophisticated in Asia, and its officers rightly believed that intelligence would win battles even before the first shot. It was this apparatus that, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, had penetrated American diplomatic codes. The so-called Purple Code, a complex cipher used by the U.S. State Department, was deciphered in record time. This break allowed Japan to accurately predict certain political movements and guaranteed the imperial leadership a growing sense of intellectual invulnerability. The optimism also extended to the European scenario. The Japanese were able to follow part of the Russian and British diplomatic traffic with a level of precision that alarmed even the Allies. With interceptors installed in Formosa, Manchuria, and the Kuril Islands, the scope was impressive. Atada's structure operated like clockwork. Each listening operator was trained to recognize Morse code patterns with minimal margin of error. Analysts compared phonemes, suppressed signal noise, and fed manual databases that already stored thousands of Western military phonetic records. They had studied the vocal patterns of U.S. commands, identified recurring intonations on British radios, and established response protocols based on hours, tones, and acronyms. All of this was fueled by a rigid doctrine, based on the belief that any human system is, sooner or later, decipherable, as long as the correct technique is applied. But this doctrine carried an invisible flaw. It assumed that the enemies reasoned under the same linguistic, cultural, and technical parameters as the empire. In seeking sophistication, they ignored the simple. By pursuing logical symmetry, they despised ancestral orality. The Navajo language in this context did not even exist as a possibility of analysis. To Ada's officers, enemy code could only come from universities, engineers, mathematicians, not young indigenous men trained in the deserts of New Mexico. This technical presumption became even more ironic when compared to the brutal industrial reality of the enemy. By 1943, while the Japanese operated 118 listening receivers, the United States had mobilized more than 12,000 military radio operators in the Pacific Theater alone. The number of tactical radios in operation by the U.S. Navy exceeded 45,000 units. The logistical disparity was so overwhelming that one Japanese analyst even suggested in an internal report that it was no longer worth recording all transmissions. It was like trying to capture rain with your hands. In industrial terms, the numbers are even more decisive. While Japan produced 2,000 military radios a year, the United States manufactured more than 150,000, a difference of 75 times. The ability to disperse, adapt, and standardize communications was absolutely unbalanced. And even with this brutal advantage, the Americans still did something that Japan did not imagine. They replaced algorithms with cultural metaphors. When the Japanese expected more complex machines, they found symbols. When they were waiting for mathematical figures, they heard birds, fish, and desert monsters. This statistical moment helps to measure the ideological blindness that crossed the conflict. If this surprises you, comment below with the phrase, "Logistics wins." History needs to record not only the combats but the intelligence behind each silence. Despite previous victories for Japanese intelligence, one point was beginning to quietly bother the most experienced officers. There were transmissions that defied any attempt at categorization. They were not random, but they also did not conform to any known pattern. They had rhythm, cadence, military time, but the phonetics seemed to come from a forgotten language. The first reaction was to doubt the origin. Perhaps they were sounds scrambled by technical glitches. Maybe they were fake broadcasts, but the signals were clean, constant, and always occurred before precise offensives by the U.S. Marines. Reports began to pile up. In the Solomon Islands, analysts identified uncatalogued signals shortly before landings. In Rabaul, an officer recorded more than 50 transmissions, with a clear structure but vocabulary totally outside the European or Asian spectrum. A bizarre hypothesis was even raised. Were they codes issued by Filipino tribes in the service of the USA? The idea was discarded due to lack of strategic logic, but it shows how unprepared Japanese doctrine was for the kind of war Americans were beginning to fight, a war where internal diversity became an external weapon. The first major break in this illusion would come on Guadalcanal, where a transmission of only 14 seconds, made by a Navajo coder, was intercepted, transcribed and analyzed for 4 days, without result. And while the Japanese were studying the phonemes, the position of their machine gun was destroyed with absolute precision. This was just the first of hundreds of silent defeats. In the next part, we'll look at how the Japanese machine desperately tried to make sense of this new sound, and what they discovered when they brought a captured and tortured Navajo native face to face with the code that spoke his own language. And yet, he didn't understand. When the first signals were intercepted in the Solomon Islands, ARDA unit analysts did not sound the alarm. At first, the sound seemed like just another military voice transmission, something common among the U.S. Marines. There was rhythm, symmetry, and frequency compatible with tactical patterns. But the words, they didn't fit. He was not English. He was not French. It was not Russian, nor was it any Filipino, Malay, or Aboriginal dialect ever catalogued. The first reaction was technical. The operators assumed a reception error. They repeated the tests, adjusted the filters, cleaned the records. The sound persisted. Clear, precise. It is completely incomprehensible. In the following days, the frequency increased, and with it, the frustration. The message arrived clear with clear prefixes and suffixes, regular pauses and tonal variations that suggested linguistic structure. But the decoding did not advance a millimeter. The Japanese listening system, accustomed to traveling between Romance, Germanic, and Asian languages, crashed in front of sounds that did not obey the common alphabetic or phonetic logic. It was like trying to decipher wind in the form of a voice. The first attempt at analysis resorted to the statistical method. Phonemes were grouped, compared, tabulated. It was hoped to discover frequency patterns, as one would do with any Western cipher. Nothing emerged. Musical analysis was then tried. The tones were so specific that there seemed to be an underlying scale. Oscillators were used to transform sound into image. One hoped to identify melodic repetitions, perhaps even patterns of military intonation. The result was harmonic chaos, sounds that had identity but no repetition. Each broadcast seemed unique, with no fixed vocabulary, no predictable phrases. The only constancy was the uselessness of the methods. Ada's doctrine was based on two pillars: operational predictability and centralization of knowledge. For each new cipher intercepted, there was a standardized flow of approach: transcription, phonetic comparison, database query, and decoding by analogy. This process worked well when dealing with code based on substitutive ciphers or in known languages. But in the face of the Navajo code, all the steps were stuck. The transcription was inaccurate, the comparison useless, and the analogy non-existent. There was no book, table, or reference capable of offering a single starting point. For the first time, Japanese intelligence faced a phenomenon that escaped its own logic, a code that did not need a machine, had no fixed standard, and could not be reproduced without cultural domination. In September 1943, an internal report signed by Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada raised an uncomfortable hypothesis. He suggested that the sounds could come from a North American Indian language. Yamada had studied at Stanford before the war and was aware of the linguistic diversity of the native peoples, but his remark was dismissed. The High Command saw no strategic sense in recruiting indigenous people. The Japanese imperial vision, marked by a racial and technocratic bias, simply did not allow it to be considered that a historically marginalized group could carry the key to American military superiority. The analysis was shelved. Time passed, and the repetition of failures began to generate despair. More than 300 broadcasts were recorded between Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. None was understood. None provided clues. Meanwhile, American attacks were gaining precision. Entire bases were destroyed by coordinated artillery in real time, and the Japanese watched helpless, unable to intercept, anticipate, or react. With each new broadcast, analysts knew another offensive was being articulated, and they would do nothing. War was no longer just physical. It became psychological. It is in this context that the Japanese command makes a crucial strategic mistake. He attributes the failure to encoding and not to language. It assumes that the problem lies in a new American piece of equipment, in an advanced electronic cipher, perhaps a portable cryptographic system like the M209. For this reason, he decided to direct his efforts to the interception of physical material: radios, notebooks, operators. None of them, however, would bring answers, because the secret wasn't in chips or gears. It was in my mind, and even more profoundly, in culture. The peak of frustration would come at the end of that year. At an outpost near Peleliu, operators intercepted a 13-second message just before a naval attack that destroyed 2 artillery posts in less than 10 minutes. The recording was considered one of the clearest ever received. It was sent to the Tokyo Center, where 3 senior linguists analyzed the phonetics for a week. In the end, they wrote a lapidary opinion: structured language, high tonal variability, unparalleled in the known bases, probably derived from undocumented dialect. The note, although technical, concealed an ideological collapse. Japanese intelligence had just admitted it did not understand what it was hearing. In the following months, more desperate attempts were authorized. Buddhist monks who specialize in Sanskrit were consulted. Scholars of dead languages were called upon. Dutch, French, and Spanish colonial archives were opened in search of some phonetic approximation with lost dialects. Nothing. One analyst proposed that sounds could be created artificially, like an invented language. The suggestion was rejected for lack of operational plausibility, and yet it was more acceptable than the truth. The U.S. was using its own cultural diversity as a strategic weapon. The language that the West itself had tried to suppress had become the invisible shield of its troops. By the end of 1943, it was no longer a question of breaking the code. It was a matter of admitting ignorance, and for an empire that prided itself on understanding everything before the enemy spoke, that was unforgivable. A silence that screamed. In the next part, silence turns to pain. Japan captures a young Navajo soldier, believes it has finally found the key to the mystery, and discovers the hard way that not even those who spoke the language could understand the code. While Tokyo analysts plunged into desperate attempts at deciphering unknowingly, They were faced not with a code in the technical sense, but with a living language, and an ancient one. Navajo or Diné Bizard belonged to the Athabascan language family, with roots dating back centuries before European contact on the American continent. It was not just a language with a different structure, it was a way of thinking, of ordering the world. Unlike the Indo-European languages, Navajo was verbal at the center, constructing actions through complex sequences of prefixes and suffixes that altered meaning with minimal variation in tone. The language had 4 tones, high, low, ascending, and descending, and any intonation error completely changed the meaning. A single word could have hundreds of phonological variations, and many of them did not exist in written form. The Navajo language, by its nature, was already almost impossible for adults to learn. Still, he survived. Despite school bans, physical punishment, and systematic policies of cultural erasure conducted by the US, government itself, the language has endured, spoken clandestinely by communities that kept the tradition alive through orality. And it was precisely there, in the isolated reserves of the southwestern United States, that the American military found the missing piece to reverse the intelligence game in the Pacific. The idea did not come up in Washington labs, nor at strategic Pentagon conferences. It came from a civilian, Philip Johnston, the son of Protestant missionaries who had grown up among the Navajos and learned the language fluently. In 1942, while reading about the security problems of battlefield communications, Johnston suggested something radical. Why not turn the Navajo into a coded military system? Unlike mechanical ciphers that relied on devices, tables, and keys, the use of a naturally complex language would create an almost impenetrable and impossible to replicate layer of security. The proposal seemed absurd to some officers, using an indigenous language as a weapon of war. But the Navy decided to test it. In a demonstration held at Camp Elliott in California, 2 groups of Navajos transmitted standardized military messages. Whereas it took a traditional radio operator nearly 30 minutes to encode and decode a simple order, Navajo speakers completed the same process in less than 20 seconds with absolute accuracy. No mistakes, no repetition, no predictable pattern. General Clayton Vogel, present at the test, immediately authorized the creation of an experimental unit. In May 1942, the first 29 Navajo code talkers were recruited. None of them had technical training. They were pastors, students, local workers. But they knew the language, and they knew how to protect her. For weeks, they worked in an isolated facility developing the code base. The challenge was twofold: to adapt a language that lacked military terminology to a modern war vocabulary, and to create enough redundancy to ensure that the code was not unraveled by frequency analysis. The solution was brilliant. Instead of translating directly, they created metaphors. One bomber was described as a vulture, a submarine like iron fish. A destroyer became a war whale. For the letters of the alphabet, they created multiple words that represented the same sound, alternating randomly to confuse any attempt at statistical mapping. The letter A, for example, could be encoded as ant, apple, or arrow, depending on the context. Each coder memorized more than 200 terms. There were no books, there was no paper. The code only existed within the mind of the person who carried it. The historical irony was brutal. The Japanese Empire, which had invested years in studying American English, Germanic standards, and even Malay-Polynesian dialects, did not consider that the key to the broadcasts lay precisely in the group that the West itself marginalized. The US had spent decades trying to erase the Navajo language. Now they depended on it to win a war, and the Japanese, faithful to the logic of technical supremacy and cultural homogeneity, did not even know where to start. For them, a valid language was one taught in universities with grammar, structure, and dictionary. They could not conceive that an oral dialect, spoken by a few tens of thousands of people in the arid lands of Arizona and New Mexico, could become the most powerful cryptographic barrier of the century. In Japan, early suspicions that the broadcasts could be based on an indigenous language were dismissed as absurd. Internal reports reinforced the ideological bias. Indigenous people did not have organizational capacity, much less technical skills. But in Washington, that view was beginning to be reversed. The success of Navajo code on Guadalcanal proved that the strategy worked and it was scalable. The coders were sent to all divisions of the Navy, and the code began to evolve. New terms have been added, new metaphors created, and whenever a unit was transferred, the vocabulary adapted to the geography and type of combat. The code was never exactly the same, and for this reason, he was never vulnerable. While Japan analyzed sounds and built theories about state-of-the-art acoustic ciphers, the United States won battles with what it called living language. There was no machine capable of simulating the sounds, intonations, and grammatical subtleties of the Navajo. Even fluent speakers, as we would see later, would be unable to understand the code without specific training. The code was made by natives, for natives, and each of them knew the responsibility they carried was not just military, it was cultural. They were using their own identity to protect lives, transforming the language that the government had tried to destroy into a war shield. But there was something that American strategists did not yet know. The Japanese were about to capture a Navajo alive, a prisoner who spoke the language, a prisoner who, theoretically, could break the code. It was the chance Japan had been waiting for, the golden moment of imperial intelligence. But what came next was even more confusing and painful than any cryptogram, because the young man spoke Navajo, but he still did not understand what was being said. The project that would give rise to the Navajo Code began in an almost improvised way. In March 1942, Philip Johnston, a civilian and World War I veteran, presented his proposal to the Marine Command. He had known the Navajo language since childhood, having grown up on the reservation where his father served as a missionary. His proposal seemed at first glance absurd. To transform a marginalized language, and until then systematically repressed, into a strategic weapon of war. But Johnston had an unbeatable argument. The structure of Navajo, with its tonal complexity, verbal grammar, and lack of similarity to any European or Asian language, was virtually impenetrable. More importantly, it was spoken fluently by tens of thousands of natives who, by tradition, did not record anything in writing. A code that could not be stolen, that could not be studied, and that only existed in those who carried it in their minds. The proposal was put to a practical test. At Camp Elliott, California, 2 Navajo volunteers relayed a tactical battle message which was successfully decoded in 20 seconds. The same message, when encrypted by the M209 machine, took more than 30 minutes. The result was unequivocal, and so the experiment became doctrine. In May 1942, the first 29 young Navajo arrived at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. They were not engineers, they were not cryptographers, they were shepherds, hunters, children of traditional families of the reserve. Many barely spoke English. Several had studied at federal boarding schools, where the native language was forbidden under corporal punishment. Still, they were confined to a locked room for 8 weeks, where they had to develop, from scratch, a tactical communication system based on their own culture. Paperless, no recordings, no book. Everything they created would have to be memorized. The challenge was to create a military vocabulary, capable of transmitting quickly and clearly complex messages in real time, and at the same time, resistant to any attempt to decipher. The solution came from metaphor. A bomber came to be called a vulture, the bird that circles before attacking. A submarine became the iron fish. A fighter plane was named hummingbird, fast and agile. For the alphabet, the coders avoided the trap of statistical repetition. Each letter gained multiple phonetic equivalents. The letter E, for example, could be represented by different words, used randomly. This nullified any chance of frequency analysis, one of the basic code-breaking techniques. By the end of the training, 201 terms had been defined and memorized. The code was ready, but only inside the heads of 29 men. The most surprising aspect was not only the effectiveness of the system, but the fact that it completely contradicted all the premises of traditional cryptography. The Japanese and Germans built their interception strategies based on logical predictability, mathematical patterns, linguistic redundancy, phonetic repetitions. The Navajo code operated on another frequency, in the literal and symbolic sense. He did not obey linear logic. He did not use standardized words, and it could not be translated without a full understanding of the cultural context that generated it. He was, first of all, human, organic, changeable, and therefore inviolable. This collective construction, based on memory and disciplined improvisation, was the opposite of what was taught in Japanese military universities. While Tokyo officials relied on formulas, algorithms, and interception flows, the Navajos relied on oral tradition and absolute accuracy of speech. A syllable error could cost lives, therefore they trained until exhaustion. In the words of Chester Nez, one of the original 29, to speak correctly was a matter of honor. Each sound carried responsibility. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content like this. Stories that the official story almost left behind. The training of these men went beyond communication. It was physical, psychological, and spiritual. Many bore the burden of protecting not only the Marines at their side, but also their own language, a language that, until a few years earlier, had been considered an obstacle to national integration. Now it became essential for the survival of entire battalions, and even more, it became a strategic secret. So much so that coders were forbidden to share any information, even among themselves outside of authorized transmissions. Each message sent represented at the same time an act of war and cultural resistance. At this point, Japan was still without any lead. Its operators kept recording transmissions that seemed to coordinate attacks with millimeter precision, but which, even after hundreds of analyses, revealed no decipherable pattern. While their cryptographers searched for logic in frequencies and spectra, Navajo coders relayed orders with terms like turtle attacks ironfish or hummingbird carries thunder egg. For those who did not understand the code, they were just poetic or absurd phrases. For the Marines, they meant bombardments, coordinates, retreats, and offensives. The most impressive thing was the scalability. The code grew, adapted, changed shape as the battlefield demanded. New weapons, new terms, new targets, new metaphors. Nothing was fixed. And since there was no printed material, nothing could be captured. Each transmission was like an arrow shot into the air, lethal, silent, and impossible to recover. In the next part, we'll look at how this code, created by pastors, structured without paper, and maintained only by memory, has stood its greatest test in the field, and how he destroyed in seconds a Japanese artillery stronghold, even though it was completely intercepted. The real litmus test for the Navajo Code wasn't just in the boot camps. It was measured against the very tools in which the United States placed its technological trust. During the first months of 1942, the Marine Corps conducted comparative tests between Navajo coders and the most advanced cipher machine they had at the time, the M209. This machine, developed by Switzerland and widely used by American forces, operated on the basis of rotating gears, encrypting messages letter by letter through a specific mechanical combination. It was considered safe and reliable, although it required formal encoding and decoding steps, as well as a trained operator at each end. In the tests conducted at Camp Elliott, the orders were identical: a request for a coordinated attack with location, time, and type of weaponry. The M209 took 28 minutes to process, transmit, and decode the message. Navajo coders did the same thing in 18 seconds. No paper, no machine, just voice. The practical impact of this difference was not theoretical. In a theater of war like the Pacific, where troops moved through dense jungles, distant islands, and with limited logistical supplies, the speed of communication decided the survival of entire platoons. An artillery request, delayed by 10 minutes, could mean the loss of an outpost. A poorly communicated retreat, the encirclement of a battalion. Japan, although technologically disciplined, maintained a hierarchical model of warfare, where orders descended in chains through rigid channels. The American structure, by integrating the coders into the frontline units, accelerated the decision-making process to the extreme. The commander in the field gave the order, the Navajo coded on the spot, radioed it, and seconds later, the answer came, in the form of artillery or reinforcement. The Japanese listened to everything, and they didn't understand anything. What for them were disconnected tribal noises, for the Americans were attack coordinates, mental maps of advancement, and descriptions of enemy movement. The impossibility of effective interception took away from Japan one of its strategic pillars, anticipation. From Manchuria to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese General Staff's plans had relied on intercepting and decoding Allied communications. Now his wiretaps picked up clean signals, but without any usable content. It was like watching thunder and not knowing where the lightning would strike. The cumulative effect of this was devastating. On Guadalcanal, August 1942, 15th Navajo Code Talkers were detached with the 1st Marine Division. The Japanese had already decoded previous transmissions and were waiting for the American offensive. But with the arrival of the Navajo, the patterns broke down. Orders began to emerge with unprecedented speed. The Japanese knew when the Americans were about to act, but not where or how. In one of these transmissions, Chester Nez sent the exact coordinates of an enemy machine gun nest. The message lasted 14 seconds. It was intercepted in real time. But since no one in the Japanese barracks could translate it, no counteraction was possible. Minutes later, American guns extinguished the nest. The interval between interception and destruction, less than 5 minutes. This speed created an even more paralyzing side effect: psychological breakdown. Japanese officials began to distrust their own crypto network. If the Americans could communicate with such speed and accuracy, what else were they hiding? What other technologies, invisible to Japan's eyes, were being used? The Japanese High Command, accustomed to operating under the certainty that its technological doctrine was superior, derived in part from German consulting, and the Prussian model of military engineering, now found itself cornered by a system that contradicted all the manuals. The enemy did not use algorithms. He used birds, fish, insects. He used metaphors. And he won. In practice, the coders began to take on critical liaison roles between the tactical units and the higher command. They were present in landings, ambushes, sieges, and evacuations. Each message transmitted became more than military communication. It was a living piece of engineering, shaped in real time, adapted to the context, leaving no trace behind. There were no code books to be captured. There were no machines to be broken. The encoders used only the standard field radio. For the Japanese, intercepting a message meant hearing the exact sound of their defeat, with no way to stop it. One of the Japanese intelligence officers, Colonel Haru Konuma, recorded in an internal report in December 1943, "The Americans have come to use a code which nullifies all the efforts of our intelligence. The messages are fast, invulnerable, and incomprehensible. Our anticipation system has failed." The failure, however, was not only in the equipment, it was in perception. Japan, and also Germany, fashioned their war doctrines on the premise that the enemy would express himself by rational, logical, and predictable means. The Navajo was the negation of that. It was a symbolic expression, mutable orality, living culture. The magnitude of this error would only begin to be realized in the following months, when Japanese intelligence would redirect dozens of analysts exclusively to study what they came to call ghost transmissions. And what they would find, when deciphering the phonemes without understanding the content, was not a new type of machine, but an old Native American language that the West itself had tried to erase. In the next part, we will reveal Japan's desperate reaction to facing a code that resisted torture, science, and time, and the tragic fate of the only man they thought could translate it. By August 1942, with the American landing on Guadalcanal, the Japanese were ready. The previous months had been marked by maritime victories and successful interceptions. Imperial Navy intelligence closely followed the movement of Allied fleets, efficiently translated coded messages into English, and planned counterattacks based on communications picked up in the air. They expected another predictable confrontation, but instead, they found emptiness. The American broadcasts continued. The signals were present, same rhythm, same radio power, same cadence of voice, but the words no longer made sense. The contents had disappeared. It was the debut of the Navajo. 15 coders had landed with the 1st Marine Division, and in the first few hours, took over critical communication roles between forward units, air support, and naval commands. They moved with the battalions, carried portable radios, and broadcast full instructions in a language the Japanese had never heard. The Japanese response was immediate: increase surveillance, record everything, intensify reporting. But the content of these broadcasts was pure frustration. The sounds had pattern, symmetry, and speed. They were too organized to be random, but unclassifiable. It was not English, French, Spanish, or any Asian language. What they heard seemed to come from another logic, from another war. This break in expectations produced devastating effects. The Japanese, who had become accustomed to intercepting attack plans hours or even days in advance, suddenly lost that advantage. In one of the first actions reported by the Marines themselves, an infantry unit was surrounded on the bank of the Tenaru River. A Navajo code talker was called. He relayed the coordinates of the position, requested air support and called for evacuation for the wounded, all in less than 30 seconds. Japanese radio picked up the message. The command in Rabaul received it, but without deciphering, there was no reaction. In less than 10 minutes, the Americans counterattacked accurately, regained the position, and inflicted significant casualties. The Japanese report, dated Aug. 23, mentioned only unexpected enemy action, probably based on classified information. Over the next few weeks, this pattern would repeat itself. Japanese troops prepared for ambushes found themselves outnumbered by American units that knew exactly where and when to attack. Japanese intelligence, unable to understand the messages, began to suspect internal espionage, defectors, even new forms of radar. No one suspected that the answer was on the radio itself, but camouflaged within an ancestral language. One of the analysts, Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, a Stanford graduate before the war, wrote in a report, "The structure is one of language. There is logic in the sounds, but we did not find correspondence with any catalogued language. It feels like something completely alien. More than an alien, he was invisible. And this invisibility paralyzed the Japanese decision-making process. Confidence in its cryptographic capabilities had been a pillar of its strategy. Now, without deciphering, the officers hesitated. One notorious example occurred in September, when Japanese intelligence intercepted a sequence of short messages in a completely new pattern. They were accompanied by American naval movements. The logical hypothesis was of an imminent attack, but with no content deciphered, the command hesitated. He did not mobilize reinforcements. The next day, the U.S. Marines attacked one of the most heavily fortified positions on the island, with precision-timed naval and air support. The fortification fell in less than 6 hours. The Japanese once again heard the order, and they did nothing. The irony of this defeat is profound. While the Japanese believed that they would win by discipline, code, and the predictability of Western language, they were defeated by a form of communication that they never considered military. The Navajo, trained to memorize 211 specific terms and convey messages clearly and quickly, were winning a war without firing a shot. Their code not only resisted interception, it completely nullified the enemy's advantage in one of the central pillars of modern warfare, communication. From a logistical point of view, this represented a revolution. Each Navajo coder effectively replaced dozens of cipher operators. While Japan was allocating analysts, linguists, and equipment to try to intercept and translate conventional transmissions, the United States was reducing this entire chain to a radio and a voice. And they still won at speed. When, weeks later, the Japanese began recording these transmissions for later analysis, they discovered another obstacle. Even intercepted messages, repeated in the laboratory with phonetic accuracy, could not be decoded because the code was mutable. The same term could be said in 3 different ways. The same concept was translated by analogy. One fighter was a hummingbird, a warship, an iron whale. None of this fit the German language manuals that Japanese intelligence had studied so much. The signals officer of the 17th Army, Colonel Haruo Konuma, wrote in December 1942, "The Americans are using a code whose origin we do not know. Its phonetic nature is incompatible with conventional analysis systems. We are fighting in the dark." For the first time since 1937, the Imperial Army fought without anticipation. He was deaf to the storm. The Battle of Guadalcanal was not only the beginning of the American offensive in the Pacific, it was the beginning of the end of the Japanese certainty of superiority. And what would come next would add to the confusion, because the Japanese would finally identify a prisoner who spoke that language. And even so, they couldn't decipher anything. In the next part, learn the story of Joe Kailumia, the Navajo soldier who, even under torture, was unable to help the enemy, because even he didn't know the key to the code he was talking about. Joe Kailumia, a Navajo soldier captured in the fall of Bataan in 1942, became Japanese intelligence's greatest hope for breaking the enigma that was already eroding the empire's confidence. He spoke Navajo fluently. He was young, resistant, and in the eyes of the interrogators, he carried the key to deciphering the transmissions that appeared as ghosts on the radio. When the first recordings were placed before him, Kailumia recognized the words, but not the meaning. What I heard were familiar terms, yes, but combined in a way that was so out of everyday use that they became unrecognizable. He would tell the officers, "I understand the language, but I don't understand what that means." The interrogators' response was not technical, it was ideological. They did not accept the idea that a language could carry within itself a second, invisible language, structured by metaphors and associations that only trained coders knew. For them, if Kailumia spoke Navajo, he had to understand everything, and it was this rigid belief that doomed him to the following months. The interrogation quickly changed tone. First came the demands, "Translate." Then came the threats. Finally, the brutal methods. But for the Japanese, the frustration grew even greater with each sincere denial from Kailumia. He wasn't lying. He did not have the military vocabulary. I didn't know the code. And, contrary to what his captors supposed, knowing the language was not enough to decipher the transmissions. The structure of the Navajo code had been created precisely to prevent an ordinary speaker from understanding its military content. Even among the coders themselves there were variations. The system was alive, changeable, and depended on constant training. Kailumia, used as a piece of psychological pressure, symbolized not only the physical endurance of a soldier, but the conceptual failure of an intelligence that believed it could break everything by force or mathematics. In early 1943, recordings began to be played repeatedly before him. He recognized turtle, hummingbird, vulture, but none of it formed comprehensible sentences within everyday Navajo. To a trained coder, the turtle is attacking the ironfish, meant tank-to-submarine attack. For Kailumia, it was just poetic nonsense. It was then that Japanese frustration turned into obsession. If the prisoner said he did not understand, they concluded that he was resisting. They never considered their assumption to be wrong, that the code was not translatable by an ordinary native. Thus, Japanese intelligence insisted on the basic error. It believed that the language was the code, and he didn't understand that the code was something else, a layer built on top of the language, invisible without specific training. The structural irony of this is profound. By 1943, Japan had invested more than 20% of its intelligence resources in interception and decoding operations, wishing to achieve the same accuracy that Germany sought with its Enigma machines. But on the other side of the ocean, the United States produced not only superior machines, it produced 12 times as many military radios as Japan and 20 times as many portable encryption systems. If this data surprises you, comment below with the phrase, "shocking data." For the Americans, logistics was not a detail. It was the backbone of the war. And at the intersection of technology and cultural diversity, they have created a code that no industrial empire has been able to break. While Kailumia faced months of interrogation, Japanese analysts continued to record and catalogue thousands of transmissions without progress. They wrote down tones, pauses, rhythms, looked for connections, tried to reconstruct patterns. Nothing worked. The imperial belief that every mystery could be forced to reveal itself, either by science or by pain, crumbled before a young man who spoke the language, and yet he could explain nothing. Later that year, the final report on Kailumia was devastating to the morale of Japanese intelligence. The prisoner understands the language, but he does not understand the content. The code has a structure that is not discoverable by ordinary means, probable specialized system of internal training. It was the first time that Japan had admitted, even internally, that it was dealing with something beyond its doctrinal field of vision. But this recognition came too late. The battlefield was already beginning to feel the direct consequences. Each week, Navajo transmissions guided landings accurately, coordinated combined attacks, and nullified the Japanese advantage of anticipation. Kailumia survived captivity, scarred but alive, and never having revealed a single useful word to the enemy. He was not the keeper of a secret. It was living proof that Japan was fighting a war it did not understand. And yet, the biggest surprise for the Japanese would not come from Kailumia. It would emerge when they decided to abandon torture and bet everything on science. mobilizing linguists, universities, and even Buddhist monks to try to break the Navajo code. In the next part, we will see how this decipherment task force turned into the greatest intellectual failure in Japanese military history. By early 1943, the Japanese were accumulating dozens of hours of Navajo transmissions recorded on wax cylinders. By the end of that year, there were hundreds. And as 1944 approached, the shelves of the ARDA unit were crammed with sound recordings, all identical in one fundamental characteristic: absolutely indecipherable. The frustration had reached such a deep stage that the General Staff of the Imperial Navy authorized an unprecedented mobilization. What, until then, was treated as an operational nuisance is now officially classified as a critical cryptographic threat. And with that, the largest operation of attempted decipherment ever carried out by Japan during the war began. Entire universities were called up. Linguistics departments in Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka received copies of the recordings. Teachers specializing in comparative phonetics, many of them admirers of ancient languages such as Sanskrit and Tibetan, tried to identify etymological roots in the sounds. Nothing. Navajo phonology, built on the Athabascan system, was so far removed from Asian linguistic matrices that any correspondence was impossible. Japanese sound culture, based on 5 vowels and simple tonal patterns, simply did not have the auditory structure necessary to decipher what they heard. When that first wave of studies failed, the Navy turned to less conventional experts. Buddhist monks were called in to analyze the tones, believing that their training in liturgical recitation could identify repetitive patterns. Classical musicians tried to convert phonemes into notes, looking for hidden melodies that indicated some cipher system. Engineers developed special equipment, including an oscilloscope adapted to record variations in frequency and amplitude, graphically capturing each intonation curve. In theory, it would be possible to reconstruct repeated patterns by comparing similar transmissions. In practice, they found that there was not enough repetition for statistical analysis. With each new message, new combinations of sounds emerged. Even when the same term appeared, it came up with tonal variations so subtle that they destroyed any attempt at classification. It was like trying to map a storm using ruler and compass. The despair was growing because, despite the growing intellectual effort, the impact on the battlefield was immediate. With each undeciphered transmission, the Americans executed coordinated attacks with increasing precision. Artillery batteries were destroyed within minutes of transmitting reports. Japanese troops were surrounded by units that, in theory, should not have known their position. Japanese intelligence, so accustomed to anticipating, now always reacted too late, and this eroded morale. Internal reports, preserved after the war, record expressions such as, "If the enemy knows where to attack before we can understand his orders, we fight blindly." And they fought. To try to overcome the phonetic barrier, the Japanese resorted to comparisons with indigenous languages of Siberia, believing that they could find some common root. Nothing. They looked for similarities with native Alaskan languages documented by Russian anthropologists. Nothing. They compared it with dialects from the interior of China, with languages from the Philippines, with records of Spanish missionaries from the 16th century. The Navajo remained an isolated linguistic island, and the code, a fortress within that island. The more they looked for associations, the farther away the center of the puzzle seemed to be. In 1944, naval intelligence assigned 30 cryptanalysts exclusively to the study of the Navajo problem. It was the largest team dedicated to a single code in Japanese military history. They worked for a combined 2 years, 24 months of non-stop trying, thousands of hours of listening, repetition, and phonetic transcription, and they did not produce a single word translated. A note, found after the surrender, sums up the breaking point. It is humanly impossible to decipher this without knowing the soul of the language. For the first time, the Japanese admitted that a code could be invincible not by mathematical complexity, but by cultural depth. It was an implicit acknowledgement that the war had crossed the boundaries of technology and was now fought in the territory of identity and oral tradition. This intellectual impasse became even more tragic when the Imperial Navy concluded that capturing more Navajo prisoners would be the only solution. Rewards were offered. Troops were given direct orders to prioritize American radio operators in the field. but they didn't capture any coders. Each radio recovered was a conventional radio. No notebook, no table, no key. Only one operator killed next to it. The enemy left no trace, and this generated another layer of frustration. There was no way to attack the code by material logic. At the same time, the United States was accelerating its industrial production of communications. By 1944, they had manufactured more portable radios than Japan had produced since 1937. The contrast was so great that for every Japanese transmitter in the field, the Americans had nearly 15. This explains why the Navajos could operate simultaneously in dozens of battles, while the Japanese struggled to intercept everything but no longer understood anything. It was the victory of logistics over rigidity, of creativity over dogma, and diversity over homogeneity. But the biggest shock was yet to come. In 1945, in the most brutal battle in the Pacific, 6 Navajo code talkers would single-handedly coordinate the assault of 30,000 Marines, transmitting more than 800 messages without a single error, all while being intercepted all the time. And there, in the black sand of Iwo Jima, Japan would finally realize that the enemy possessed a weapon that no empire was prepared to face. Between 1943 and 1945, while Japan believed it had seen the height of the Navajo enigma, the real crypto-terror was still just beginning. The code they had tried to crack on Guadalcanal no longer existed in the same form. He had changed, grown, becoming more complex. Because, unlike Japanese cipher machines, rigid, gear-based, predictable, and dependent on fixed patterns, the Navajo code was a living entity, molded not in formulas, but in minds. He adapted to war as quickly as the Pacific filled with new ships, new planes, and new weapons. The Japanese didn't know it, but while their cryptography team spent months analyzing old recordings, the Navajos were already operating with new vocabulary, updated, revised, and expanded, as the American war effort expanded. Expansion began in late 1943, when the Marine Corps realized that the original code was just the foundation. The industrial war in the United States was accelerating with a force never seen in history. By 1942, the country had produced 48,000 airplanes. In 1943, it produced 85,000. Each new model, P-47, P-51, F-6F, B-29, required new vocabulary. Every new vessel, from destroyers to Essex-class aircraft carriers, needed proper metaphors. The Navajo, who had already created 211 initial terms, began generating dozens of new words per month. There was no delay. There was no bureaucracy. The war changed and the code changed with it. Bomber was no longer just the metaphor of the vulture. Now there were strategic bombers, dive bombers, torpedo bombers. For each paper, an image. For each image, a word. It was a kind of engineering without machines, pure cultural engineering. This malleability was the terror of Japanese analysts. Nothing in their training allowed them to conceive that a code could transform in real time. They studied static patterns. They were looking for repetitions. But on the Navajo, each war generated a metaphor. Each metaphor opened up a new field of meaning. And the code talkers didn't just memorize, they lived those words. They came from their cosmology, their animals, their spiritual geography. The code was efficient because it was intimate. Each message carried centuries of history condensed into seconds of transmission. The Japanese were trying to find formal coherence. The Navajos operated with symbolic coherence, and this cultural distance was insurmountable. The most emblematic example of this process occurred when the United States began to develop the atomic bomb. In 1944, the first rumors of a new weapon reached the Pacific, fragmentary information, classified, but enough to require the code to contemplate the elusive. The Navajos coined the term Ayashi, which literally meant metal egg. The simplicity of the image hid the magnitude of the weapon, and more importantly, it avoided any linguistic clues that could reveal what was really being transported. If a Japanese person heard that, he would think of common artifacts. Nothing suggested the existence of a superweapon. Perfect encryption wasn't just in the tongue, it was in the way the metaphor hid the world. Meanwhile, Japan remained stuck in the interception paradigm. Reports from late 1943 show that Japanese intelligence still believed that, given enough time, it would be able to establish phonetic equivalences between different messages. They didn't understand that the code had been designed to avoid exact repetitions. The letter A, for example, was not represented by a single word, but by 3 or 4 alternatives, and the encoder never repeated the same option consecutively. Each operator created micro-variations. The living language became a living cipher, and the enemy, who was looking for a mathematical formula, was getting further and further away from the goal. In 1944, when Japan had already mobilized 30 analysts to work exclusively with Navajo transmissions, frustration finally reached an institutional level. An internal report recorded, "The code changes without warning. Similar words appear in unprecedented combinations. There seems to be structure, but not logic." This recognition was more serious than they admitted, because while Japanese intelligence drowned in theory, the United States was building the greatest war machine the world had ever seen. By 1944, the Americans had produced more ships than Japan had built in the entire previous decade, more tanks than the entire Axis, and above all, more radios, a torrential stream of equipment that allowed the Navajos to be deployed on all fronts simultaneously. The more communications there were, the more impossible it was for Japan to identify patterns. The American industrial victory turned into a cryptographic advantage. The continuous creation of vocabulary also had a psychological effect within the units. Coders have become masters of adaptation. When new weapons arrived, they improvised terms on the spot. A flamethrower? Scorpion fire. Heavy naval artillery. Thunder of the sea. Kamikaze fighters? Wind of death. The beauty of the system lay precisely in the ability to immediately understand the metaphor. A Navajo knew nature by instinct. I knew that a scorpion attacked quickly, burned, left a trail of destruction. He knew that the sea roared like thunder when furious. He knew that the wind could be a messenger or a killer. The culture was cryptography, and crypto was culture. Try as the Japanese might, they never found an entrance. There was never a numerical standard. There was never a phonetic root. The mutant code was, to them, an endless mass of familiar but incomprehensible sounds, a language that refused to be imprisoned. Even when they captured intact American radios, they found only ordinary transmitters, no codebooks, no instructions, no tables. Nothing revealed that that weapon was not in the equipment, but in the operator himself. The Navajos were, quite literally, part of the cryptographic system. To remove the man meant to remove the key, and so it was never possible to capture them alive. As the code evolved, the gap between the communication capabilities of the United States and Japan widened. Commander Masao Yamada wrote in 1944, "It is probable that this code is organic. It transforms. It renews itself. There is not enough stability for analysis." With this phrase, without realizing it, he accurately described the living nature of the Navajo language and signed, in a way, the epitaph of imperial intelligence. And the impact of this system was still far from its peak, because in 1945, on the island of Iwo Jima, the Navajo code would cease to be just a shiny system and become an absolute strategic force, coordinating the largest landing in Marine Corps history alone. And there, in the center of the storm, the ancestral language would become the backbone of American victory. In November 1943, as the Marines advanced on the beaches of Tarawa, Imperial Navy radios picked up a continuous stream of American transmissions. What should have been a clear map of the offensive has once again turned into a wall of incomprehensible sounds. On the American side, 6 Navajo code talkers had been working non-stop for more than 70 hours, transmitting coordinates, ordering naval fire corrections, updating the position of ground units, and sending medical evacuation requests, all under intense fire, all in seconds. The battle, marked by one of the most brutal defenses ever built by the Japanese, became a stage where American tactical silence, a silence made up of words that no one could decipher, destructured the entire defensive logic of the empire. At Tarawa, the accuracy of American naval gunfire surprised even the Marines themselves. 406mm guns made corrections with a margin of error of less than 15 meters, something impossible without an agile and safe communication system. The Japanese recorded dozens of transmissions, but found no correlation between sound and impact. Each explosion seemed to come out of nowhere. Every American maneuver sounded unpredictable. For the first time, Japan was fighting an enemy that spoke clearly and acted with precision, but who to them seemed completely mute. When the Mariana Islands campaign began in June 1944, the phenomenon became even more evident. On Saipan, 24 Navajo code talkers operated almost without interruption throughout the first 48 hours of combat. The transmissions coordinated armored strikes, secondary landings, naval barrages, and simultaneous air support. At times, American radio seemed like a perfectly organized military symphony. Each unit sent an order, each coder returned a response, and each response was converted into practical action in a matter of seconds. On the other side, Japanese intelligence recorded the same volume of transmissions, but for them it was pure chaos. They could not distinguish general orders from distress calls. They could not identify phonetic patterns. And worse, they could not predict attacks. Japanese officials report that it was like fighting a force that came and went at random, with no apparent logic. The troops defending Saipan, accustomed to anticipating American movements thanks to interceptions, were now completely blinded. Each counterattack was disorganized. Each withdrawal, late. Each fortified position was surrounded by units that, supposedly, could not have moved so fast. This strategic blackout reached its most critical point on Peleliu, where the mountainous terrain and reinforced caves required absolute precision for any offensive operation. There, a single Navajo coder, Jimmy King, operated for 6 consecutive hours after his partner was killed by enemy fire. He coordinated 3 battalions simultaneously, sending more than 40 messages under direct fire, each determining artillery corrections, flanking movements and evacuation calls. The Japanese intercepted all transmissions, and, as always, they understood nothing. The Japanese defense, built on the premise of static resistance and punctual counterattacks, crumbled in the face of an enemy that communicated with industrial speed. Every minute, a new bombardment. Every hour, a new maneuver. And at the end of the day, the bitter certainty. They were fighting in the dark. The invisible American superiority in these battles arose not from more powerful weapons, though they had them, but from a command and control network that functioned with machine speed and human flexibility. Japan had slower, less powerful, and fewer radios. In 1944, for every Japanese radio on the battlefield, the United States had 15. This didn't just mean greater redundancy, it meant greater breadth of coordination. When a Navajo coder transmitted an order to 3 units at the same time, it did so over a network, something outside of Japan's capability. The Imperial Navy simply did not have the infrastructure to keep up with this avalanche of communications. Their intercepts, once so useful, were now a form of intellectual torture. They picked up everything, understood nothing, and watched helplessly as the enemy shaped the battlefield with absolute clarity. Japan's growing inability to interpret movements became evident in official reports. An officer on Saipan wrote, "The enemy has changed its communication doctrine. We don't know where to attack anymore." Another in Tarawa remarked, "They act as if we are blindfolded." The truth was even more cruel. They were blind, but thinking they saw. Confidence in their cryptographic capabilities, once sustained by years of victories, now became a psychological trap. Japanese operators believed that more time, more recordings, more analysis were enough, but the more they studied, the less sense they found. Meanwhile, the Navajo code kept expanding, inventing terms, adjusting metaphors, responding to the needs of war in real time. The same language that many Westerners had tried to suppress became one of the central engines of the most powerful military machine of the 20th century. Each battle reinforced the same truth: whoever communicates faster wins. And in the Pacific, no one communicated faster than a Navajo coder. The war, which Japan believed it could control with interceptions, slipped through its fingers, not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked discipline, but because they faced a cultural weapon that their doctrine did not know how to interpret, and that weapon, silent and alive, was about to become even more devastating in the operation that would define the fate of the Pacific Campaign, the Black Hell of Iwo Jima. When the first American ships appeared off the coast of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi believed he knew every inch of the island. He had spent 2 years turning that piece of volcanic rock into an underground fortress, 11 miles of tunnels, interlocking pillboxes, armored depots, invisible firing points. For him, victory depended on a simple equation: intercept interpret, and anticipate. Every American move was to be detected by Japanese radios, turned into intelligence, and converted into timed counterattacks. But what Kuribayashi didn't know was that on that day, 6 Navajo code talkers were going to dismantle all the defense logic he had taken years to build. In the first 48 hours of combat, these 6 men transmitted and received more than 800 messages, each translating, with absolute accuracy, the movement of more than 30,000 Marines, who landed under heavy fire. They were positioned in craters behind debris, squeezed between rocks, their antennae vibrating with the impact of the explosions as their voices pierced through the chaos with the coolness of a perfect system. On the Japanese side, all that was captured in real time. Operators listened to the Navajo's fast, steady, and sure cadence, but they could not extract any meaning. Kuribayashi even received reports with exact times of the broadcasts, and no words translated. The Japanese doctrine, so dependent on anticipation, has turned into absolute blindness. The efficiency of the code on Iwo Jima bordered on the impossible. On one occasion, when an American unit was trapped in front of a wall of enemy fire, a code talker relayed an urgent request for naval fire. In less than 20 seconds, the USS Pensacola responded, adjusted the rate of fire of the guns, and extinguished the machine gun nest that had been holding up the advance. The Japanese intercepted the entire sequence. The transmission to them sounded like a strange song full of abrupt tones and glottalized sounds. The American response, however, came with surgical precision, and in that moment, Kuribayashi understood that his fortress, built with calculations and engineering, was being defeated by something that no doctrine foresaw, a spoken code that no industrial empire could break. The Japanese had bet everything on technology and predictability, believing that radio would be their strategic ally. But in practice, those who dominated the radio dominated the island, and the Americans dominated it with a weapon that Japan had despised from the beginning: cultural diversity as a force of war. This contrast becomes even more evident when we analyze the industrial structure that supported that moment. By 1944, American industry produced more than 70% of all military radios used by the Allies. While Japan could barely equip a division with portable radios, the United States flooded the Pacific with modern, redundant, effective equipment. With each Navajo coder, there were 2 backup radios and an entire network dedicated to amplifying their voice. To get an idea of the imbalance, the American production of communication equipment was 15 times greater than the Japanese one. If this number surprises you, comment below with the phrase "logistics wins." In the tunnels of Iwo Jima, this difference was overwhelming. With each American order transmitted, the Navajos returned clarity. With each Japanese order transmitted, the Americans intercepted, translated, and reacted. It was an asymmetrical war at the most fundamental level, that of communication. Kuribayashi realized this on the first day. He had planned for his observers, hiding on the slopes of Mount Suribachi and in the central caves, to send reports on the American advance. But these reports meant nothing if the enemy moved with a coordination that Japan could not foresee. The Americans attacked where the defenses were weakest, precisely because their coders transmitted in seconds every weak point discovered in the field. On one occasion, a Japanese unit attempted a night counterattack based on interceptions. They believed they had identified a flaw in the American flank, but when they advanced, they found the American artillery already in position, as if they knew exactly where they would spawn. The truth was simple and devastating. The artillery knew, and he knew because a Navajo coder had transmitted the information in 3 seconds. The messages continued without errors. American operations lined up like cogs in an industrial machine. And Japan, even with all its discipline, had no way to compete. An internal Japanese report of that battle repeated the same phrase, almost an involuntary confession: "We are fighting an enemy who already knows what we are going to do." Japan's technical superiority in close combat, its courage and its culture of sacrifice, none of this was of any use if the structure that guided its actions was blind. The fight had turned into a battle between who could see the field and who could only hear noises. In the final days of Iwo Jima, when defeat became inevitable, Kuribayashi sent a final message to the High Command. American communications remain impenetrable. Its units act with absolute precision. We can't anticipate any movement. It was the final realization of a war lost not by brute force, but by the force of information. And ironically, this information was transmitted by a culture that the American government itself, decades earlier, had tried to silence. But the war still had an even more brutal chapter in store, because if Iwo Jima had revealed the efficiency of the Navajo Code, Okinawa would show its full range, for the first time operating simultaneously on dozens of fronts, coordinating the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific. And there, in front of 183,000 American troops, the Japanese would realize that the silence of the code was not only invincible, it was absolute. The Japanese collapse in the face of the Navajo Code did not end on the battlefield. He continued, silent and corrosive, inside the command rooms themselves, where officers trained in the technocratic logic of the empire tried to understand how they had been defeated by something that did not fit into any known model. For these men, educated on the doctrine of Japanese cultural superiority and trained in German methods of encryption, the idea that an indigenous language, considered primitive, backward, unsuitable for modern warfare, could completely disarm imperial intelligence was more than a military failure. It was a philosophical coup. For years, Japanese propaganda had insisted on the image of a rational, disciplined, and technologically superior East facing a decadent West. But in the silence of the Navajo broadcasts, what collapsed was the very foundation of that belief. They hoped to decipher machines. They received metaphors. Post-war interrogation reports reveal a pattern of intellectual humiliation that finds no parallel in Japanese military history. Lieutenant Masao Yamada, one of the most respected cryptanalysts in the Imperial Navy, confessed to American investigators, "We were prepared to defeat any American machine, but we were not prepared to defeat cultures." This phrase, which seems simple, actually exposes the deepest conceptual flaw of the Japanese effort. For them, war was a technical and mechanical competition. Culture, orality, and native identities had no place in the strategic analysis. They were seen as obstacles, not as potential weapons. Thus, when the United States incorporated indigenous languages as an instrument of war, it produced something that Japan could not even imagine, let alone fight. The Japanese press and military command had repeatedly disparaged the Native American peoples, calling them tribal wastes of a decaying nation. This realization has blinded them to America's true advantage, diversity as a strength. While Japan bet on homogeneity as a strategic virtue, the United States mobilized different peoples, cultures, and knowledge like cogs in a gigantic military machine. American plurality, seen by the Axis as weakness, was transformed into organic superiority, and nowhere was this more evident than in communications warfare. While the Japanese studied Western patterns, Germanic sounds, and European maritime traditions, the Americans looked inward to their own land and discovered in it an ancient weapon that shortened distances, accelerated decisions, and created invisible advantage. Japan, by underestimating these parallel worlds, ignored that modern warfare is not decided only by steel, but by knowledge. Internal reports compiled after the surrender show the growing bewilderment within the crypto cause. A document signed by Commander Hiroshi Hiraoka recorded, "The enemy used a language that did not exist for us. Our studies did not include peoples without technological writing. We assumed that these peoples could not develop complex communication systems. We were wrong." The coldness of the phrase does not hide the brutality of the emotional impact. This was an admission of total defeat, not about the code itself, but about the worldview that had shaped the entire intelligence structure of Imperial Japan. The shock did not end there. When the Americans revealed after the war that Navajo code talkers had transmitted more than 17,000 operational messages without a single error, Japanese officials were incredulous. They had mobilized linguists, engineers, mathematicians, and monks. They had created equipment, analyzed tones, compared phonemes with Siberian languages, studied recordings for years, and yet they didn't translate a single meaningful sentence. An officer interrogated in 1946, Captain Minoru Yamada, summed up the sentiment. "We have never faced a more perfect code. It was not a mechanical construction. He was human, and that's why he was invincible." The word human here deserves attention, because for Imperial Japan, Humanizing the enemy was dangerous. Nationalist ideology depended on the dehumanization of the other. And yet, the American victory came precisely from what the empire considered irrelevant: plural humanity. This linguistic failure mirrored an even greater failure, that of understanding the adversary in his totality. Japan knew American industrial power. It knew its aircraft carriers, its bombers, and its tanks. But I didn't know his soul. He did not understand that this nation, built by immigrants, native tribes, distinct communities, and disparate languages, carried within itself an arsenal that could not be measured by factories, the arsenal of cultural complexity. The Japanese expected the United States to fight with machines, but the Americans fought with voices. They expected decodable formulas. They received symbols. They expected predictability. They found creativity. The failure was not technical. It was philosophical. Japan calculated everything, except the possibility that it was wrong about who the enemy really was. They believed that the world fit within the rigid structures of the empire, that diversity weakened, and that indigenous traditions belonged to the past. But the battlefield proved otherwise. Every Navajo message sent on Iwo Jima, Tarawa, Saipan, or Peleliu was a reminder that no empire can win a war if it does not understand that intelligence is not just calculation, but culture. It is not just a machine, but memory. It is not just logic, but identity. And as Japan tried to make sense of sounds it would never understand, the world was preparing to hear the final confession, the public admission by its highest officers that they had been defeated by an enemy they could not even name. When the war ended in August 1945, ships began to return, flags were reattached to masts, and American streets erupted in celebration. But in this same country celebrating victory in the Pacific, hundreds of men who had secured that victory returned home without anyone even knowing what they had done. Navajo code talkers disembarked on night trains, makeshift military trucks, small buses that traversed quiet deserts. There was no press waiting for them. There were no speeches. There were no medals. Most returned to poor reservations, with little infrastructure, segregated schools, and state laws that still denied them the right to vote. They had coordinated decisive battles: Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, but they couldn't get into many American restaurants. They had transmitted thousands of messages without a single error, but when they returned, they were once again seen only as Indians, a word loaded with stigma by the same people who benefited from their courage. The federal government, which had relied on them to protect military secrets that would define the fate of the planet, now imposed silence on them. The Navajo Code Talkers program remained classified for 23 years. None of them could tell their parents, their wives, or their children what they had really done. Many returned carrying deep traumas, memories they couldn't share, and a moral weight no one was allowed to hear. They were forbidden heroes. The hypocrisy of this situation is even more evident when we look at the post-war geopolitical scenario. As Japan reorganized its military institutes to study the failure of its intelligence, detailed reports on the Navajo Code began to emerge at conferences and cabinets. The United States buried history. The silence was not a coincidence. It was deliberate. The Pentagon believed that the Navajo Code could be reused in future conflicts, especially in the nascent Cold War. Thus, men who risked their lives on Guadalcanal, who relayed orders under direct fire on Iwo Jima, who guided entire landings on Okinawa, were placed in a kind of patriotic limbo, essential to victory, but invisible to the narrative. The military instructed them, "You can't talk about it, never," and they obeyed as they had always done. The discipline they showed in the war turned to silence in the post-war period. This institutional erasure had profound consequences. Many coders faced difficulties finding employment because their military records were generic and did not reveal their critical function. When they asked about the service, they only said that they had been radio operators. Nothing more. The country for which they had fought did not offer benefits commensurate with the importance of their mission. Some, like Chester Nez, later recounted feeling ashamed, not because they had served, but because they were not allowed to say why their service mattered. Others kept the secret so deeply that they died without even telling their grandchildren. The paradox was brutal. While Japanese officials admitted as early as 1947 that the Navajo Code had been the empire's greatest cryptographic defeat, The US government itself refused to publicly acknowledge that such a victory had existed. Injustice was repeated in all dimensions of civil life. In states like Arizona and New Mexico, many code talkers returned to communities that still faced segregated censuses, insufficient schools, and policies that attempted to Americanize Navajo identity by force. Men who had used their language to save entire battalions returned to a country that, a few years earlier, had banned that same language in boarding schools. The irony is painful. What the government has tried to erase for decades became, during the war, the decisive weapon to defeat an enemy who considered himself technically superior. And yet, after the victory, they tried to erase it again, not out of contempt, but out of bureaucracy. Nothing is more cruel than serving a country that cannot recognize your service. This invisibility began to slowly change only in the late 1960s, when the program was finally declassified. But the decades of silence had left their mark. Many coders were already dead. Others were too old to seek recognition. And yet, when the first ceremonies took place, the American public was shocked. No one knew those men existed. No one knew that the code that defeated Japan did not come from machines nor from laboratories, but from indigenous minds trained in the desert. For years, movies, books, and documentaries had extolled pilots, generals, fleets, and tanks, but never the voices that guided it all in the dark. The memory of the war was incomplete, and the country ate its own history to protect its security. But the erasure did not go unanswered. When the reports began to emerge, first in military meetings, then in articles, then in interviews, the impact was explosive. The American press finally began to ask, how had one of the greatest contributions of the native peoples to the victory of the Allies been left aside for so long? How could men who had saved thousands of lives not received medals, pensions, recognition? How had a nation that prided itself on its freedom silenced its heroes for 23 years? And the answer to these questions, complex, painful, historical, led to the reparation that we will see in the next part. Because the country that hid them decades later would have to face the moral debt it owed them, and to recognize them before the world. The turning point began slowly, almost timidly, when in 1968 the US government finally declassified the Navajo Code Talkers program. It was like opening a door that had remained locked for more than 2 decades and letting the country, for the first time, hear the voices that had echoed on the battlefields of the Pacific. The first reports emerged in meetings of veterans, in discreet conversations between aging soldiers who, when they discovered that they could now speak, realized that they carried bigger stories than they imagined. On reservations in Arizona and New Mexico, curious reporters began to appear, asking silent men if they had really used their tongues as a weapon of war, and the answer, always given with humility, changed the understanding of American history. For the first time, the country saw that victory in the Pacific was not just the work of its aircraft carriers, factories, tanks, and bombers. It had also been the work of indigenous voices that transformed culture into strategy. The irony of this story is that the solution was before everyone from the beginning, hidden in the desert, while entire nations searched machines for answers. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. This rediscovery generated a growing movement of recognition. In the 1970s, veterans organizations began to include code talkers in official ceremonies. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan proclaimed National Navajo Coders Day, putting them on the national calendar for the first time. But true recognition required something more. It required the country to elevate them to the same level as the heroes whose names were already in the history books. This reparation would begin to take shape in the 1990s, when researchers, anthropologists, and retired military personnel began to record detailed interviews with survivors. Many of them were at the end of their lives, but their memories remained intact. They clearly described the beaches of Tarawa, the caves of Peleliu, the Black Mountain of Iwo Jima. They recounted how they had transmitted messages under fire, how they had heard Japanese operators try to imitate their language, how they had felt the weight of carrying with them a weapon that no enemy could understand. As these testimonies came to light, the cultural impact was immediate. Schools have begun to include the topic in history programs. Televised documentaries have brought the story to millions of homes, and little by little, the country realized the size of the moral debt it carried. It was this movement, coupled with the persistent efforts of veterans and academics that led Congress to pass the law in 2000 that would award America's highest legislative honor to the original 29 coders, the Congressional Gold Medal. In 2001, at the Capitol, survivors gathered for the historic ceremony. Many of the 29 had already died. Some died at a young age, others left before knowing they had made history. But 5 of them were present, elderly, silent, dressed in their veterans' vests and their embroidered hats. Among them was Chester Nez, the last survivor of the first class, who decades earlier had created with his own hands the vocabulary that would defeat the Japanese war machine. The scene was recorded in photos and newspapers around the world. Chester walked slowly to the pulpit, looked at the audience of congressmen, military personnel and cameras, and uttered a phrase that carried the full spiritual dimension of the deed. "We use our sacred language to protect this nation." There were no elaborate speeches. There were no grandiose metaphors. Just a direct, humble, and powerful statement. The statement of a man who had seen the horror of war, carried the weight of responsibility, and kept silent for decades. He represented all who could never tell their stories, all who died before recognition, all who returned to forgotten reservations carrying honor without medals. It was at that moment that the country finally understood. The Navajo Code was not just a military tool. It was a bridge between worlds, a historic feat that proved that culture can be as powerful as any weapon. After this ceremony, the theme finally received the space it deserved. Films were produced, museums created exhibits dedicated to coders, and schools on the reservations began teaching history with renewed pride. The impact was more than military, it was cultural. A language that had been banned in the classroom became a national symbol of strength. An identity that the government tried to suppress has become part of the official memory of World War II. And the Navajos themselves began to look at their language with new eyes, realizing that their ancestors had protected the country using something more powerful than guns. They had used their heritage. The late recognition did not erase the injustice, but gave voice to the silence. And while the 2001 medal was the high point of that reparation, history still had a symbolic chapter to reveal. The moment when the Japanese themselves, decades later, would publicly admit that they had completely failed in the face of that code. An unexpected confession, and one that would show the world that their defeat was not only military, but intellectual. Next, we will see what the officials of the old empire said when finally confronted with the truth. The Japanese testimonies collected after the war reveal a silent collapse that does not appear on maps or in armament statistics, but which redefined the very military logic of the empire. The admission that despite all the technical, intellectual, and institutional effort, Japanese intelligence never managed to decipher a single Navajo message. In late 1945, as Japan rebuilt physical and moral ruins, U.S. investigative teams interviewed officers of the former ADA communications unit, men who for years had considered themselves the cryptographic elite of the East, trained at prestigious universities, some trained in Germany, others experts in phonetics, others masters of diplomatic codes. And yet, when confronted with Navajo recordings that had already been declassified, they all repeated the same phrase: "We never understood that." Lieutenant Shigeru Fukumoto, who had worked directly on tonal analysis, confessed in 1946, "It was so simple and elegant that we never considered it possible." His statement epitomized something deeper than a technical error, revealed a doctrinal blindness. The Japanese prepared to face European encryption machines, algorithms, and standards. They expected mechanical systems, numerical figures, identifiable repetitions. And so they spent years concentrating resources on technologies that, although advanced for the time, operated within a rigid mental structure. What they did not foresee, and could not foresee within the ideology that shaped them, was that the enemy would not use machines but memories. It would not use written codes but an ancestral language formed by verbal logics that are impossible to reproduce without cultural experience. Captain Minoru Yamada admitted that, even after 3 years of analyzing recordings, he could never identify where one sentence began and where another ended. The tones, high, low, crescent, descending, seemed to displace meanings before his eyes, making every attempt at transcription a baseless task. He recalled, during an interrogation in Yokosuka, that the team believed they were dealing with an artificial dialect, perhaps invented by the Americans to confuse analysts. But when he learned in the post-war period that the code was based on a real language, he acknowledged, "We assumed that indigenous peoples had no linguistic sophistication. That was the fatal mistake." Other testimonies reinforced the same pattern. Commander Hiroaki Abe described how for months his team tried to compare Navajo with indigenous languages from Siberia, with Filipino dialects, with ritual chants from Southeast Asia, all to no avail. Oscilloscope machines showed tonal patterns that didn't fit anything previously catalogued. Every attempt at phonetic equivalence failed. The Buddhist monks consulted said that the sounds resembled languages created for spiritual rituals, with no logic accessible to the Japanese ear. The Imperial Navy, obsessed with standardization, simply could not accept that a communication system could exist without a uniform alphabet, without written grammar, without reference material. That cognitive shock deepened when officials discovered that Navajo code talkers had memorized more than 600 military terms without ever writing a single line. Lieutenant Yasuo Matsumoto, during an interview in 1947, stated, "We were fighting against a human capacity that we could not measure." The phrase "harsh and resigned" exposes the intellectual collapse of the empire. A military structure based on the belief of cultural superiority found itself defeated by a language that its own ideology classified as inferior. The crypto defeat was also a moral defeat. With each testimony, it was clear that Japan had not only lost the battle of the machines, he had lost the battle of ideas. Imperial forces believed that modernity resided in technology, and that indigenous peoples, because they did not have complex written systems, could not produce anything that threatened a modern military power. The mistake was not in the instruments, but in the look. When, in the 1980s, Japanese academics revisited the archives, even more forceful statements emerged. Professor Teo Yoshikawa revealed that for 2 years, about 30 analysts worked exclusively with Navajo broadcasts, and in the end, produced only reports full of speculation and frustration. No translation, no breakthrough, no entry point. Captain Minoru Yamada added, "The Navajo code represents perfect encryption. We never found weakness. There was no standard. It was a circle without fissures." The most symbolic point of this admission came during a military intelligence symposium held in Tokyo in 2010, when the elderly Admiral Hiroaki Abe declared before an audience of experts, "We have not been defeated by American machines. We were defeated by American diversity." This phrase, replicated by Japanese newspapers and quoted by scholars, has become a symbol of a belated revelation. Japan has prepared itself to face industrialization, but it has not prepared itself to face plurality. The cultural wealth of the United States, made up of dozens of peoples and languages, was transformed into a strategic advantage, an advantage that the empire, shaped by cultural homogeneity, had no way of understanding. And as these belated confessions surfaced, another, even more ironic development emerged, the realization that the Navajo Code would be used as a benchmark for security operations throughout the Cold War, because the Japanese defeat did not mark the end of the code. It marked the beginning of his global influence, something that will reveal his definitive weight in the next part. The Navajo Code was not just a military instrument, it was a demonstration that language, when rooted in culture, can function as the most advanced form of human technology. For American strategists who observed its performance in the Pacific, it was clear that they were facing something that no machine could replicate, a living, organic system capable of adapting in real time to tactical and conceptual changes. While the Germans and Japanese invested in metal rotors, linear algorithms, and controlled repetition, Navajo encoders employed a logic that predated any computer, the logic of ancestry. Unlike mechanical ciphers, Navajo was an agglutinative language in which complex meanings arose from the combination of multiple elements into a single word, changing direction, time, intensity, and even purpose with simple tonal variations. To those who didn't grow up within the culture, every sentence seemed like a shifting soundscape. For coders, it was absolute precision. Phonetics included ejectives, voiceless side fricatives, and glottalizations that didn't even exist in English or Japanese. It was impossible to transcribe it on paper without destroying its structure. Any written reproduction already became something else, and that alone made the code indestructible. The enemy needed to hear, interpret, and decode something that could not be fixed, frozen, or schematized. It was a technology that lived in the mind. This organic quality made Navajo a cryptographic system naturally resistant to reverse engineering. Each metaphor created by the initial 29, airplane as hummingbird, submarine as iron fish, bomb as metal egg, was not arbitrary, but inserted into an essentially visual and symbolic way of thinking. Navajo reasoning did not separate object from function. The metaphor carried purpose. This ensured that the code never relied on literal translations, but on layers of meaning that only fully existed within the culture. While the Japanese tried to identify patterns, believing that language-based codes would need to follow a decipherable logical chain, the Navajo functioned like a river. It flowed, changed, folded in on itself without losing internal coherence. It was impossible to follow him without knowing where that river had originated. That was the ultimate shock to the enemy analysts. They were used to cryptography derived from mathematics, but before the Navajo, they discovered a system derived from cosmology, territory, and orality. There was no machine capable of penetrating this. Throughout the 1940s, while the Axis countries invested in machines such as Enigma, Purple, and optical decoding devices, the United States observed a unique phenomenon, the existence of a code whose processing depended 100% on the human brain, and paradoxically, this made it faster than any machine. The M209 needed time, adjustments, configurations, and disk rotation. A Navajo coder needed seconds. The difference was not only in the speed, but in the principle. Mechanical cryptography attempted to limit errors. Human cryptography based on orality eliminates the category of error itself, because the code does not depend on external objects. It lives within the one who carries it. This turned the Navajo into a milestone in the history of military communications. Not because it is exotic, but because it represents the apex of a logic that the West had forgotten. The idea that culture and language are complete, sufficient, and when mastered, superior technologies. With the end of the war and the subsequent declassification of the program, several security experts began to study the Navajo model to understand how a living language could reach levels of security that machines could not. NSA researchers in the 1970s reviewed the system and identified 3 principles that would be applied in the future to modern protocols: structural unpredictability, no fixed record, and continuous evolution. These principles would appear decades later in concepts of adaptive cryptography, decentralized network protocols, and even authentication systems based on cultural behavior, areas where mathematical linearity often fails. In this sense, the Navajo Code was not just a weapon of World War II. It was a precursor of creative security models that only became viable with the digital age. Communications engineers have even classified Navajo as organic cryptography, a term that defines code based on non-formalized systems that are impossible to reproduce without cultural immersion. And this explains why no machine, no laboratory, and no empire has been able to break it. The strength of this system was, therefore, in what Japan considered irrelevant: humanity. It was precisely the human element, memory, cultural fluency, symbolic thought, that made the code impossible to decipher. Modern warfare, plagued by numbers, production, and statistics, has found in the Navajo a fundamental truth. Technology is not just what you build, but what you transmit. The coders proved that an ancestral language can be stronger than any gear, that a song can defeat a circuit, that a metaphor can surpass a cipher. They demonstrated that absolute security is born not from formulas, but from roots so deep that no algorithm can pull them out. And that realization paved the way for an even greater understanding, one that would shape strategic debates throughout the Cold War. If a culture-based code defeated Japan, what would happen when the world realized that the planet's indigenous languages carry structures as complex as any machine? The answer, and its implications for the future of global crypto, reveals the latest move in this story. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers exposes a truth that 20th century powers never imagined facing. The decisive force that brought down an empire came not from an army, an aircraft carrier, or a factory, but from an ancient language that the United States nearly destroyed before it needed it. While Japan built its military doctrine on the idea of cultural purity and ethnic superiority, the United States, even without fully understanding it, carried within itself a much more powerful arsenal, human plurality. And this plurality, so often marginalized, has become a strategic weapon. The Navajo Code revealed this contradiction with brutal clarity. He demonstrated that what seemed fragile, a language without writing, preserved in isolated reserves, and subjected for decades to policies of forced assimilation, contained a structural complexity capable of defying the best of enemy technology. The real historical irony is that for a long time the American government itself tried to erase this language. Boarding schools punished Navajo children who dared to use it. Teachers said that their culture was an obstacle to modernity, and it was precisely this culture, this language, this oral memory that secured crucial victories in Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. Japan, with all its technical apparatus, never considered that the breaking point was in something that could not be catalogued, measured, or separated in phonetic tables. By seeking the perfect war, it ignored humanity, and by ignoring humanity, it lost the war of ideas. The lesson goes beyond the military conflict. It reveals that complex technologies are not only born from circuits and mathematical routines, they are also born from experiences accumulated over centuries, sculpted in rituals, stories, and ways of thinking that escape mechanical logic. Navajo cryptography was not a 20th century invention. It was the modern crystallization of ancient cultural wisdom, and this should serve as a warning to the contemporary world, which still insists on putting technology and identity on opposite sides. Diversity is not a strategic weakness. It is a reserve of possibilities that no opponent can predict. When a nation despises its minorities, it destroys its own future tools. When he values them, he creates weapons that no enemy can copy. Japan discovered this too late. The Navajo Code is therefore more than a military feat. It's a moral lesson. It shows that what a society tries to erase may be exactly what will save it at the most decisive moment. And it reveals that real power is not measured only by steel but by voices, voices that carry worlds. But this lesson, powerful and definitive, is not yet the end of this story, because the final chapter reveals an even greater paradox. The message that the coders sent to the world did not end in 1945. It continues to echo silently in the way we understand culture, security, and freedom. When the dust of war finally settled, the strategic truth became impossible to ignore. The Axis, for all its doctrinal rigidity, collapsed in the face of a force that could not fit into spreadsheets, manuals, or machines. Japan fell without ever deciphering a single Navajo phrase. Germany collapsed without realizing that American production of engines, trucks, and radios exceeded its responsiveness in insurmountable proportions. What united both failures was the same ideological blindness, the belief that military superiority is born of cultural and technical purity, when in reality it depends on the sum of human capabilities that a homogeneous empire cannot foresee. The Navajo Code was living proof of this thesis. It wasn't the most expensive, it wasn't the most mechanized, it didn't rely on labs, but it defeated entire interception systems because it was anchored in something the Axis didn't know how to combat: plurality. The Japanese technical collapse and the German industrial collapse show the same strategic consequence. Those who underestimate diversity lose. And this lesson goes beyond war. It echoes in every military, industrial, and economic decision of the modern world. Just as logistics determine the reach of an army, diversity determines the reach of a nation. Just as manufacturing defines the speed of response, culture defines resilience in the face of the unpredictable. No algorithm replaces human understanding. No machine overcomes what lives only in the memory of a people. That is why the Navajo Code remains, to this day, the only large-scale military system ever broken in combat, because it was not born from gears, but from roots. And that's why decades later, even German officials recognized that American power lay not just in industry, but in the breadth of its peoples. One of them summed it up with bitter irony. When analyzing the failure of the Axis, we were not defeated by tanks, we were defeated by what we didn't understand: trucks, radios, and cultures. If you value serious research and the search for historical truth, please leave your like and subscribe now. This allows us to continue bringing deep analysis like this. Also comment on what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video, the speed of transmissions, the total incapacity of the Axis, or the strength of an ancestral language transformed into a decisive weapon, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact we're going to reveal. Because history, like the Navajo Code, lives on. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.